Ben Sandofsky, welcome to the work item.
Hey, happy to be here.
It's so exciting to be here with you because you are one of the co-founders of Lux, which is the studio that builds Halide, and I am a big fan of Halide. So before I start kind of talking about just the app and all the project, I want to learn more about you. So you had a pretty remarkable career that we're going to get into this show, and I want to learn more about what started it all. Where did it all get started?
Sure. I think a lot of people, depending on who you ask, they'll start at a different point as to their origin. So if you want to go way, way back, you could start when I was 8 years old, and I was lucky enough to be exposed to programming. In my elementary school, they had Apple IIs in a computer lab, and they taught us Logo, which is a little turtle that draws on screen. And so, throughout growing up, was sent to a computer camp uh, in Western Massachusetts for a summer, and we learned Pascal. And then, in junior high and high school, I was playing around programming there before I got into university, and double majored in computer science and humanities with a concentration in theater. Uh, and after I graduated, going through school, I didn't really know what I wanted to do in programming or even if I really enjoyed it. And I felt like I could do maybe graphics programming, work in visual effects, or do computer animation. And I didn't even have really any internships or anything lined up to bring me down that path. So I got out of school. I was like, okay, what do I do now? And I figured maybe, well, one path to get there would be maybe if you're in LA, there's a lot of game development, there's a lot of film, visual effects. And so I figured, I'd get a job down there, and this web development thing, Web 2.0 was just about to kick off, and it was clear that web was, in demand. And so I started out doing web development, and as I was doing more exploration of what it takes to get into visual effects, it's like, wow, this field is brutal. This is also around the time in video games they had this famous blog post from EA Spouse that talked about crunch in the industry, and it talked about like you do 12-hour days for 6 months, and the pay wasn't really good. And this web thing, as far as effort to rewards, like web development, certainly a good way to kick off our career, and it allowed me to scale or optimize income for a while. And I could max out that stat and learn general career tricks around becoming a better developer, even though it was targeting web stuff. And so, yeah, I went through a few jobs while I was in LA there, and I eventually did optimize, like as far as like you reach senior, and pretty much all the salaries are roughly the same, and I just was feeling unfulfilled with what I was working on. And it's hard to complain, right? I mean, like if you look at someone who's in a service industry, like, don't cry, don't shed any tears for me that like, hey, like what you're working on. But at the same time, it's like, yeah, but at a certain point, if everything's paying roughly the same, what do you really want to be spending your time on? And so I just sort of woke up one day and it's like, okay, what if the reason I'm not really happy with what I'm doing has to do with the product versus doing web development or something else? And so, I made a list of products that I use and enjoy using and would love to work on. And I applied to a bunch of tech companies up in the Bay Area, and eventually landed in my job in Twitter. At the time, it was just hot up and coming. Like it was like, I enjoy it, and this was 2009, so they hadn't reached nearly the critical mass. Although they did have traction, so it's like it wasn't totally like a company no one had heard of. And so I took the risk, and I ended up taking a salary cut to work there, and I moved up to the Bay Area. And it was interesting because when I joined, you could still fit the whole company at one very large lunch table. So I think there were like 30 engineers in the company, and they still had trust and safety, a legal team, support and everything. But it was still startup-y compared to when I left in 2014, which had literally thousands of employees. They had IPO'd. And so it was very interesting seeing a company grow from that scale to big corporation starting to approach the Facebook kind of scale things. And yeah, that led to sort of my next chapters in life, which we can talk about.
What did you use for Pascal coding? Because this is something that I started as well when I was in, I want to say middle school. And I remember it was such a pain to work with it compared to the modern IDE. So I'm really curious, what was the tool of choice?
So these were, I don't remember what model of Macintosh they had at this computer camp, but it was a black and white Macintosh on whatever IDE they had. Nothing compared to today's IDEs, but they were there. I think they would do type checking at least. What's funny is that I was actually talking to some folks. I did a talk a year and a half ago in Belarus, and I was talking to some of the developers there, and I was like, "Oh, so what's your CS like? Do they teach programming in elementary school? Like when I was, really young?" And they're like, "Oh, well, we learned this language that no one really has heard of and it's never used anywhere. It's called Pascal." I'm like, "Oh, wow! You're the second person I've known who knows Pascal." So yeah, it's not as super well known, and apparently some people were like, "Man, this is a better language to teach people than C as an early language." Certainly we didn't have any of the kind of like the Rubies. I guess Ruby was out then, but it was still like some really obscure, even more obscure than Pascal. But yeah, I don't
As
remember.
somebody that grew up in Eastern Europe, that is very much relatable
Really?
because,
Okay,
yes,
there you go.
yeah, I grew up in Moldova, which is this tiny little country in Eastern Europe. So Pascal was the only language that we would learn in school. Like every single book, article, whatever you find, college, middle school, high school, everything is Pascal.
Okay, so it's like the club mate of programming languages, where if you talk to someone from Europe, they're all big on it. Like club mate's the best soda, and yeah, I don't know if you're a fan of Pascal. I have no complaints about it. Yeah.
I just remember there was very, very painful. And then I think the evolution of that was Delphi, which was a little bit better. And it was kind of like the Visual Basic. You can draw GUIs and it was a little bit more user friendly, if you will. But Pascal gave me a lot of nightmares.
I guess that's true of everyone's first language, is that you're gonna hate the first language. I've hated like well, I still hate Java, but you learn the language, but you're also learning how to code, and you're inflicting a bunch of your own pain, and you blame the language because you don't want to realize I have no idea what I'm doing. But I still hate Java.
Well, and when I went to college in the United States, they had an intro to programming course. And the language that they chose for that was C. And even at the time, I was thinking, like, are you serious? Like, you're gonna start people with C? Like, this is the one language that it'll just anyone starting with it'll probably just say, like, nah, no, 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 I don't want to do this anymore.
It's like definitely like juggling X-Acto knives, and it's uh, possibly now it's better. But in my university, they had you could choose at the time, and I think that was new. You could choose between Java or C, and Java was the object-oriented course. They didn't call it the Java course. And I remember asking the professor. I showed up early to class one time, and I was like, "Yeah, I would be interested in doing game programming, but I hear C++ plus plus is really the thing to do that." And the professor's like, "Well, we think that Java is going to be very popular and used everywhere. So we'd like to prepare students, and I guess there was a period where Java was the hotness and then Android came back and it became big again. But yeah, in a way, for my goals, I probably should have done C. At least it teaches you the lower level stuff. But, I guess college isn't necessarily about teaching you the hot languages, right? There's, I guess, a lot of people, it's the difficult thing about universities, and also the reason it's more than just sort of vocational training, right? But anyway, we're getting into all off topic there.
I mean, these are good thoughts. And like I said, to me, Java runs in your fridge. Why wouldn't you learn Java? So,
It's like, yeah,
um,
it is. It's the most close thing to a universal language, I guess. I don't know.
that's true. But I do have a question, something that you called out earlier, that you also kind of went down the road of humanities. And this is something that we hear a lot nowadays when folks talk about the fact that, a lot of the, ethical issues that come up with engineering is because engineers just do not have that background in humanities. So they don't necessarily think through a lot of these problems. How do you think the humanities aspect helped shape what you're doing today or your career, your thought process, anything like that?
Sure. And you have to walk a line here where I think a lot of people uh, I would say that don't confuse that, like having an understanding of the humanities and appreciation of it with like, don't be a dilettante where you're like, yeah, I took an English class and I'm approaching code as if it were writing. Like, go away. Like, go spend some time with real writers and understand what it actually is. And in many ways, of the successful writers and successful creatives I've known who've made careers out of it, they treat it every much as an engineering skill set as what we do. There's a very regimented approach as opposed to you sit there with writer's block all day. How can I come up with this thing? No, it's a job like anything else, right? But with that all said, I think that having a killer combination as an engineer is having the ability to articulate and communicate. Having that on top of strong engineering skill sets will unlock so many doors because some people can overweight their stats. Like if you're in an RPG, like, yeah, you're an incredible low level, assembly and everything. But if you can't sell your idea or have other people understand what you're doing, or write amazing documentation, or even now, as I'm working on selling our own products and product management, so much has been helpful, like writing, making people excited about our products in our blog posts. Um, Sometimes we'll write a blog post before we actually finish the product, where it's like in the early ideation phase, and it's something I guess Amazon is known to do. They probably don't. It's probably just hype they do to tell people on joining Amazon. But there's a story that like Amazon will write the press release before the product. And so as we're figuring out what we're building, it is helpful to be like, okay, why should people be excited? What is the selling point? Why do you need to download it right now? And being able to write about it is a super useful skill set there, and getting people excited and passionate about your products. So yeah, I'd say that there's a sweet spot. I think that if you already have a background in the humanities, and building up engineering will help, but I wouldn't say. I think as far as diminished returns, getting a degree in English is not going to help you as much as a degree in CS or other engineering skills like mathematics, physics, or anything that's like engineering oriented. But certainly fleshing out, and this is what's nice about a U.S. education. I've heard that in Europe, the university system is a little more vocational, where they don't focus. Like if you go for a skill set, you might know more. You'll know more about this than me. But I've heard that they don't focus as much on the humanities. But what is one of the nice things is that, like when I got my CS degree, you had to have English or humanities requirements, and they did include an ethics class. And again, it's one of those things, like just because you take the class doesn't mean ethics. And a lot of people are going to use that as an example of like all these programmers who lack ethics, right? But it was insightful to have one unit where we learned about these tragic situations of like, I forget the name of the machine, but as an example, there's this machine that was issues radiation treatment for
Oh yeah,
chemotherapy or whatever it's called.
Direct 25, I think it was.
There you go. And everyone should read about that if they haven't. But it was basically engineered in a way where there weren't checks, hardware-based safety checks to prevent overdosing people with radiation. And basically, there were people who were given lethal doses due to a software bug combined with poor usability. And fortunately, I'm so happy I just work on camera apps. It's terrible when my app crashes and you lose a photo. And I do feel really guilty when I look at like the tiny, 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 tiny number of crashes. Like, did I ruin someone's day? But no one died as a result of it. But I think now, as we're looking at like social networks and so many secondary ways that you can genuinely harm people at scale in such small ways that you don't understand the side effects, I'd say having an understanding of ethics is just important. And it's probably the greatest argument for having, similar to being barred as a lawyer, you have to take an ethics exam. If you're going to talk about having required exams for what would be required of an engineer, I honestly don't care if you can come up with a linked list, but understanding the ramifications of what you're doing and its impact on society, like that's something I'd be a fan of instituting.
Right. And even basic skills like writing and being able to convey your ideas clearly is so, so important. And especially in engineering roles where you're collaborating with design, PM, whoever else. And especially at bigger companies, I know that's probably I don't know how big of a problem it is in smaller studios, but in bigger companies, when you work with tens of different people, and even in your case, your blog posts are phenomenal in that they're so detailed and crisp that it's clear that you put a lot of effort into picking the right words and making sure that it all reads cohesively and it's not just thrown together over the wall and say, here's a product, go download the app, whatever.
Thanks. Yeah, it's it's hard sometimes to justify why are we writing the blog post. Like we should finish the product first. But it's kind of like that thing, like, and it's just going and revisiting it over and over and over again. So, like in the case of our big Mark II launch, which was 18 months long, early on in the process, we started drafting out the post. As in a way, it was almost like having a project board, like where this is effectively the living document of what we're building. And I cannot count how many times we returned to it when I realized, God, that feature's not going anywhere. And it was really helpful because I think that maybe 4 months before the release, there was a feature that wasn't coming together. And it was like, or we had the blog post and I was just reading it over. I'm like, would I be excited if I were an outsider reading this? And it really helped show us like, no, we can't punt this feature to, 2.3. We need to get this as part of the launch because it completes the story that we're going to be, working as far as PR and selling people on. And it's sort of like you can tell if you've ever seen a movie where clearly they did some reshoots at the end, like something's missing here. Well, the Justice League movie, if you've seen, not the Snyder cut's that good, but like versus the original version, like something's missing in this the first cut that came out. And it's the same thing if you just look at some products that companies will release. Sometimes it's interesting to think about the internal debates that PMs had before this thing was ultimately launched. Like whatever the Samsung folding phone that if you peel away the sticker, it destroys the phone. Like imagine, I would hope the debates that went into that and things like that. So yeah, it's helpful and yeah.
I like to think that somebody tested at least some rudimentary scenarios like that, and it's not just kind of like, all right, we built it, ship it. Once you start production, you start realizing that if you bend the screen at a specific angle, it cracks. Like, how many users will not bend the screen that way? It's scary.
It's kind of, well, again, it's almost like, and we're going back to ethics. This is not a best analogy when we're talking about stupid screens, but like if you look at the Challenger disaster, and this was another thing that I don't know if it was the ethics class we studied. I think it was a class on rhetorics as part of the humanities coverage. And they talked about like the memos that went back and forth between managers and the engineers who were calling out that there is a specific issue with the O-rings in the shuttle, and there's a probability that these could run into problems. And I think in a large company, certainly at a much less consequential scale, you can see like the back and forth between, I'm sure there's product managers like, okay, really, how many people are going to do that? We need to hit it by a date. Well, we can patch it, or they did the math on how much it would cost to recall it later, right? And it's really helpful to know, like, and identify in your own company, like, are we falling into these logical fallacies? Are we all being complacent and having the bystander effect that leads to these problems that lead to, jokes of the industry, right? So,
Yeah, lot to think about there. But I want to take a step back and talk about your career because I know that there's a lot of topics that we can discuss, and I'm still curious about your career at Twitter. So you worked there for some time, and you were the first hire on the mobile team. What was that like? Because that seems like that fundamental founding moment where you're venturing into something completely new.
yeah, and I'd say that my greatest advantage, especially early in my career, is that I had no idea the actual risk I was taking. Um, So I'd be like, yeah, sure, whatever. A very Chauncey Gardner approach to life. Go watch the everything I learned about careers. I learned from the movie Being There, where you say it's a lot of risk, but honestly, what is the worst possible thing that could happen for me in that situation, if I joined a startup and it went nowhere? At the time, I had been working professionally 5 years, so I had a nest egg that, like, if I were out of work, I wouldn't be homeless. Would it be a mark on my career? Like again, it's not like a Theranos situation. If we look back, like would it make it more difficult? If anything, it would make it easier for me to find my next gig. And in a tech hub like Silicon Valley, uh, you can throw a rock and get three job offers if if your skills are up to date and you will just say spit a certain type of profile. I'm not the qualified person to complain about that, but we'll leave that there. It's very easy for an engineer in Silicon Valley when you reach a certain level, a few years out, to get a new job. And even then, the consequences of and this is what I talked to with someone who is in LA who they were explaining at their company the best thing about being in LA is that there's so fewer tech jobs down there because when they hook someone, when they get someone in their company, if they want to, in Silicon Valley, you can just spend a year at one company, hop to the next one, hop to the next one. There's no consequences. As in LA, though, it's very fewer options to choose from. I didn't like that person. That's not a good way to look at employees. But yeah, so we say it's risky, but I don't think it was that risky. I guess there's opportunity cost, and the fact, and this is a good thing to think about, is like you take a job at a Google, which the stock is as good as cash, and compare that to a startup, which is most of your compensation at a Google is going to be equity, and in a startup, if you get the same equity, 99.9% of that equity is not worth the paper that it's printed on, right? And we can talk about later, like when I left Twitter, I was trying to figure out what to do next. There were opportunities to join the next big thing. They were at a stage earlier than Twitter. And when I joined Twitter, I would say it was after it had reached like certain critical mass and it was getting traction. It was before it was clearly on the scale to Facebook. Whereas if you're doing early stage, seed stage companies, like honestly, you better be getting something out of it more than hopefully that lotto ticket, because I can just say statistically, almost certainly, and yeah, congratulations, you won the lottery, but you're not going to make any money off the equity. Now you could get incredible experience. You could also get horrible trauma that you'll spend years in therapy trying to unpack. In the case of like a Theranos, but hopefully you have something beyond that, like dangling carrot around money. So yeah, so I'd say it was risky, but I was also at an age where I didn't have, and I still don't have kids, but and I didn't have any dependencies. Heaven forbid if I had like elderly parents who were depending on my income or something like that. Of course, I wouldn't have been able to take that risk if other people were depending on me, or if I had other concerns there. So it's all relative. So.
So do you have kind of like a thinking framework for this opportunity cost you're describing? Because it's, not for everyone to just quit their job. And like you called out very astutely that there's a couple of risks, if you have somebody that's depending on you, you have a mortgage to pay for. Is there anything else that goes into assessing, should I do X or Y in terms of job or career?
That's a good question. I'd say certainly early on, and again, I'm not to talk about other people's risks, and I'm not in their shoes, but certainly if you're female, there's all sorts of issues around opportunity cost and the expectations of women in the industry. And again, I'm not the person to be like the advocate for that, but there's that. And I would say that again, it's just the opportunity cost of, if you think that you'd be happy, I guess it's a question of what you want to do with your what want to do with your life. Are you happy, hypothetically, being at a Google for the rest of your life? And there are plenty of people that started Google, started working at Google 10 years ago after they'd ridden the roller coaster as a company to the point where they're stable, S&P level, one of the biggest tech companies in the world. And there are certain people that would love to work at a Google just focusing on one specific aspect of, the build system for Android, right? And they love build systems and they would love to work at a Google to the day they retire. And if that's your path, then you should definitely consider the steps that would take you there, to the point of like whether or not you should go to university or not, because a lot of these tech companies honestly are biased toward university backgrounds. They're biased in their hiring practices, and if anything, you could argue getting through interviews at those companies are very different than if you want to get a job at a startup, and you want to roll the lottery ticket there. If your dream is to start your own company, um, I guess that a lot of these startups, they do end up hiring from Googlers when they're at a certain stage where they need to scale. But these skill sets of being early stage, a Twitter or Pinterest or whatever. Those skill sets are night and day different than the responsibility that you need if you're at a large Google like that. So I guess the question is like, what skill sets you're hoping to develop, or even should you spend your time building a portfolio? If you end up getting a job at a cushy job at Google, do you want to build up your portfolio that you can show one of these startups? Be like, just so you know, like I can roll the punches, I can do X, Y, Z, because I guess we're going off on a tangent, but like the cliche of hiring ex-Googlers at a startup is like you'll interview them and be like, how would you do X, Y, Z if you had to? And some Googlers would be like, oh, we'd use BigQuery, or we use internal tool that was developed at Google. And then you'll say, well, we don't have that. And then their reaction will be, you don't have that? You're like, you don't want to tell them, yeah, we need to build that kind of thing bespoke to our needs. So you just end up, and there's nothing wrong with it again, as long as you're going in with the right expectation, right? So I guess that, yeah, and I say that again, not ever having a firm direction in my life of like I wanted to work at a startup, and even after I did the startup for someone else, is like maybe this isn't what I want to do with my life. It's very much improvisational from move to move. It's like a hill climbing algorithm where it's like, okay, now what's the next point where I want to go to next, right?
It's an interesting point that you called out because it reminded me of just how different the tools are between different companies. When you work at Microsoft or Google, you start getting used to specific tooling, and then you go to Amazon and they have nothing like that. And you realize just how specialized your skills were to the team and the company that you worked in, instead of having the kind of more universal applicability, if you will. And I mean, granted, if you know how to write a SQL query, moving to Splunk or something else is just yeah, there's gonna be a learning curve, but whatever, you can pick it up. But the tooling itself is so different.
I mean, that's really the divide, I think, or it's an interesting conversation is how much of programming is vocational, where you're using existing tools. How much do you really need the underlying theory to it? And you still, even if you're using Google level tools, I'd hope like BigQuery, you're still in your head thinking, what is this abstraction doing underneath? Versus, at some companies, like they'll let me put it this way: a lot of companies, they develop products through A/B testing. Like they think, I want to change this to a different shade of blue and see how it affects the numbers. Do we get more clicks? For something like that, very often it's very much paint in the lines or color in the lines kind of coding. We're using external tools. You're using a UI framework someone else built, and you're more of a analyst, I guess. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but it's less, thinking about okay, how do cache lines on the CPU work? Okay, how are we going to batch requests here? Which is a very different, much more mathematical approach. Again, being an analyst, you're still using math. So, but hopefully you get what I'm saying, where it's like you're using existing skills and different than like, arguably, do you really need a CS education to be doing a lot of the stuff that is done in these big tech companies? Whether they still expect you to have one is a different conversation, but yeah.
Right. No, that totally makes sense. And because it's, somebody likes to build the Lego blocks and somebody likes to make the Legos. It's nothing inherently wrong with any of the path. But speaking of skill sets, so you were one of the first iOS developers at Twitter. And not only did you have to kind of skill up yourself and build certain parts of the systems, but you also had to scale a team that does this with you. So you were a tech lead. How was that different, I guess, from the challenges of an individual contributor while you were at Twitter?
Sure. And it's interesting to sort of to define the difference. People don't know it, where typically there's like an engineering manager, which manages the project and people and has one-on-ones. And then a tech lead tends to be less managerial, more like architecture. I guess enterprise architects have given architect a bad name, but sort of like steering the ship and making sure that like, okay, we're doing code reviews. What's the situation on having automated tests in our app? And instilling best practices and helping scale that way. things like that. And so I was the second iOS engineer at Twitter because we had acquired Tweety at the time, which was also super weird. Doing due diligence and interviewing someone you look up to, which clearly, what can I interviewing someone who clearly knows more than you in a skill set. So I had been doing Cocoa development since 2006ish. I started dabbling in it on Mac OS, and so I'd done iPhone development a few years before, but nothing compared to what was being done with Tweety when we acquired the company. So in a way, it also forced me to up my skill set, turn it up to 11 and really like hit the books and really know it inside and out. So it really pushed me. So I would not say I came in there being some kind of brilliant, expert. So that was nice on my end, but yeah. So what you're saying there, like you do need. It is about setting best practices and also hiring. I think that's the main thing. And the best thing I heard about when I was from I think Evan Williams used this analogy is that early companies are like cement, where when the cement is still wet, it's super easy to change it and sculpt it, but then once it settles, it's going to be difficult. And I would say that the smartest thing or the luckiest thing that happened was staffing at unlike a lot of the company, we were we did a lot of diligence in staffing, um, and picking the people with the right type of outlook and native app development in best practices. And we focused on a little slower hiring and making sure we had we built a great culture around expectations around apps, for example, and by virtue perhaps having ex-Apple people to fill out the ranks, if you drop below 60 frames a second in an animation, that was not acceptable. It wasn't the end of the world, but it's like, let's get that fixed. We're just going to hold ourselves to that level. At the end of the day, look, you need to ship, you need to ship. But it's like, yeah, we just don't find that cool, right? Kind of like cooking fish in the microwave at a company. Like, that's not cool. So we were lucky in that we built out that culture there. But if you aren't careful, and this is what happened later so we were lucky that when I started, mobile still wasn't a big thing in the industry. It wasn't until 2011 that I think a lot of the companies woke up 4 years after the iPhone, like, oh, everything should be mobile. And I don't know if it's just crazy now, 10 years later, to think back to that time, but companies like Facebook were just like, okay, it's just another platform. Let's reskin our mobile website, wrap it in a shell app, and call it a day. And so it's funny, we internally had debates with external teams of like, well, why don't we just do that? We'll be able to ship so much faster. And fortunately, because we had enough momentum to be like, that's just not the way you do it, we were able to hold out long enough until 2011 when Facebook was like, and as Zuck even said, yeah, HTML5 was the biggest technical decision ever since mobile came out. It was a huge mistake if they rewrote the app. So, that's just an example of where it's an unpopular position and you need to your point around advocacy and being able to articulate, you need to navigate the politics in a company where as much as tech pretends to be analytical, a lot of it is ultimately people read an article or they fall for blog posts and they hear, oh, shell apps, write once, run everywhere, right? And you need to be able to internally advocate and push people. And so like one backdoor way of fighting this was I wrote a blog post for my own blog, which basically articulated like why shell apps don't work. And it was also my silent way of like telling people within the company, like, so here's why I'm not having this debate anymore. And then later I had a good friend who works at Google told me like, yeah, that post you made went around the rounds internally and up the chain. Like, yep, okay, cool. So it's like almost like a, I don't know, false flag battle there. So yeah, a lot of it, is political. It helps also with those arguments to have data. And so you can say something, you can say that it sucks to have dropped frames. It's easier to have a technical measurement like, okay, having slower connections and loading spinners, can you correlate that with fewer signups? Can you correlate it with less time spent in the app? Which is difficult and annoying in a large company that it comes down to that as opposed to common sense. Like loading spinners are annoying. Why is this in our app? but then you have to make an argument. Okay, well, we can do it with method X. It'll take longer. Why should we delay launching feature Y in order to make sure that we cut the load time down? Stuff like that. And that's just, that's the challenge when you're working at a big company, right? Not that I ever really mastered that, but it's just a skill set. If you want to excel at a large company like that, learn skills like that.
Well, and it's you're very accurately describing the situation of where it's somebody's baby, right? So you're calling somebody's baby ugly, where somebody's like, "Well, I was the PM for this feature that was a spinner, and now you're telling me I need to get rid of it? Like, what? No." And I know the spinner here can be a silly example, but the idea is like, well, this is mine, right? Are you taking it away? And there's a lot of that.
And on the flip side, nothing that you work on in a large company is yours. You give up that right. And I think that everyone understood that when Tweety was acquired, is that, it's obviously there was an element of, talent and input that came with the team. It was one person. But at a certain point, if you're going to work at a large company, you might own a feature, but you can't own the product. And the sooner you can become comfortable with that, and the correlation is if people are trashing your product publicly, and certainly when I was a large company, you do unpopular things that are outside of your control. You cannot take that personally. And so even when I trash larger companies, which I consider a noble target, I think it's totally fine to trash Facebook as a company for some of its practices. I try not to understand that people necessarily made those decisions. Usually, growth hackers make terrible decisions. They're unethical. But, the individual engineer who built the spinner, I feel bad for them. It's a beautiful spinner. It's not your decision the spinner has to be there. But, and if you're going to join one of these large companies, you better get a thick skin and don't go out there and be a stand for a $10 billion company and acting like what they're doing is like you're changing the world. Unless you're literally curing cancer, you're just a for-profit company. Roll with the punches, and don't get too personally attached to something. If you make a video game that's art, yeah, totally, you're making art. But if you're just you're not, most companies aren't changing the world, man. Get over yourself.
We're changing the world. We just added a flag reaction to your messages. So, but so you've done Twitter. You've done a lot of work there. You then briefly worked at Periscope, which is the streaming service. Was that your first kind of foray into, I want to say, graphics and kind of image processing? Because now you're working on camera apps, and Periscope arguably is one of those camera apps, right?
Yeah. So in I'm going to say 15, whenever I tweeted it, it was I want to, and this is one of those things where I was returning back to what did I enjoy doing on a technical level in college, and what now that I have enough of a safety net, and I'm at a point in my career where I can easily, if it fails, I could find another job. What would I really love to work on? And maybe graphics. And so I decided I'm going to learn shaders this year and lower level programming there, because it's also at a certain point when you've done front end development for a long time, you feel like you're solving the same puzzle over and over again, right? And so a lot of people, I think that it's this instinct where you get bored. That's why people go and they learn the hot new framework, and they just think that by swapping out tools, they're learning something new. And if you're ever in that rut, find something totally different than what you're doing. If you're a front end developer, look into machine learning or back end or something like that, and figure ways of when people say generalist, that's an actual generalist when you have deep knowledge of each particular, skill set. So I wanted to do more graphics programming, and I started taking the books and messing around with it. And this is true of all jobs. This is true of all jobs. The way you usually get it when you reach a certain point in your career is some friend is yeah, do you want to work here? Or you'll ping someone at a large company hey, you got any openings? And it's you can still make your way through the front door, but honestly, and this is again an example of inequality, is that once you're in, it's easier to get a job doing something else that you like. And so someone else pinged me like, yeah, you're doing graphics programming. A friend who, and this is after, to be clear, this is after Twitter had acquired Periscope. It had just acquired it relatively recently. And they're like, yeah, we have some features we wanted to build, but like our core team, like they are focused on like, integration with the main service and XYZ with signups. And so we have like some ideas on the edges here of like we'd love to do, but we can't justify, like, would you like to join and sort of prototype and possibly shift these like experimental features? I'm like, yeah, that sounds cool. And so like I joined just to do contracting. And so I do it on and off for about 6 months there. And so like the big feature I shipped initially was the ability to draw on streams. So you could actually like draw a circle around something like, hey, check out this sun or this check out this car over here. And then a few seconds later, the drawing would dissolve. And then afterwards, so after that shipped toward the end, is like they realized it would make sense to invest more in a bespoke rendering engine for their videos, so they could do stuff like that easier. So I helped them refactor and rebuild some of their video engine, which definitely did, like, this was all OpenGL, but it did later help me out when it was time to build Halide. Like, okay, this is not my first project, and I ended up building it in Metal. But it's nice to learn something and other people are paying you to. So it wasn't like when they hired me or contracted me, it wasn't like I was just cracking open a book the first day, but it gave me, and this is my advice for people who want to learn something new, is always having a project will get you to your goal faster than opening a book and just trying to memorize. That has never worked for me. So it was an amazing experience to get that opportunity. And at the end, the only reason I stopped was like, again, I'd even told them like, I love everything you've done for me and it's cool here, but I really want to finish this camera app I've been working on. And it's been nagging me for a while and I just have to know what it's like. And I just got to spend all my time dragging it across the finish line. And at the time, it was also illogical because, contracting can be, again, just financially great money. And it was like, you know what? I'd rather do this thing. And at the time, iPhone apps, especially camera apps, like there's no way you're going to make any money at that. They didn't tell me that, but that's just in general the industry perception. So it just didn't make sense to do it. But it's like, it's going to nag me the rest of my life if I don't try once building an app of my own, because I'd always worked on other people's products. And at best, they would take my input, which is good. I learned about some product development on that end, but I never was 100% accountable for every aspect of what goes into the app, right? And so that's why I had to sort of finish my own thing.
So it seems like you have a tendency to go for the hard technical challenges. And actually, reading your blog, one of the things that you mentioned is that when you interview folks, one of the things that you like to ask is, what's their most difficult technical problem that they solve? Why is that question important? Because again, for a lot of technical interviews, they ask you to, here's build me a linked list, or how do you, work with a binary search tree? And in your case, you're focusing on what's your difficult problem. Why is that important?
So what's great is learning from someone something I didn't know before. And whenever I have an interview and someone tells me a fun story and I learn something, like, yeah, I'd love to learn from that person. And so that said, there is a disadvantage. And I think someone tweeted about like, okay, does that bias yourself to people who are better at telling stories or have something rehearsed, right? And so you need to be aware of that. Ultimately, any kind of arbitrary quiz you give in the course of an hour is going to be biased. So you want to balance that out with doing research on if they have a portfolio, certainly looking at the portfolio. If they have a list of other companies they've worked at, downloading the apps they've worked at and asking them during the interview, what did you work on that app? And then trying to figure out if they're not lying. Unfortunately, some portion of the population, it sucks. Hopefully, it's a very small portion, they will lie on an interview. So you just want to, that's the extent of a technical question, is to make sure you know how to do FizzBuzz, like that you're not a total, fraud, and and you do that. But I'd also say that, and this goes to SATs and a lot of standardized tests, is that in fact, a lot of the tests you get at large tech companies are biased toward people like the SATs who have the affordance of time to just study for that test. It's Goodhart's law. Any measurement is good until it becomes the target, and then everyone's going to game the target. And you see that in large companies around A/B tests. If you target clicks, people will instill dark patterns to get that button clicked more. And so if you test for algorithms at a certain point is like, if you test someone with how many push-ups you can do in an interview, yes, the type of person who will then spend a month learning to do 100 push-ups will probably perform better at your company just because they're so eager to work at at your company that they'll try to do 100 push-ups. And then, obviously you're biased against people who have physical disabilities or don't have much of a propensity for arbitrary BS, right? So a lot of our industry is just cargo culting these stupid tests. And if you're at a Google, where you have 1,000 people vying for one position and you can skim the top 1% of the 1%, you can come up with a horrible interview process. Google has an unrelated post. They were talking about the unreasonable efficacy of big data. And it basically talks about with machine learning algorithms, you don't need the best algorithm to have the best machine learning results. If you have literally billions of images in your corpus to train an algorithm, you'll get superior results to a company with a superior algorithm, but they only have 10,000 photos to work with, right? And so it's the exact same with their hiring practices. Like if you're at a small company and you're trying to be a Google, I think you're setting yourself up for failure just because you're not going to be a Google. So I don't know. Try to beat the odds.
Yeah. So not to make this a software engineering interview, but what is the hardest problem that you've solved in your experience, your engineering career?
Uh, Unfortunately, as a business owner, I now have to deal with the idea of trade secrets. So I can't go into too much detail, but I'll say like a product feature. Last year with Halide Mark II, one of the features we wanted to do was Instant RAW, which would automatically develop your RAW photos for you to a degree where it would be like, it would get you 80% of the way there. Because a complaint from users with V1, especially if you're new to RAW, is that the photos, like, they look nothing like what you actually want when you go into an editor. So that, because it was so open ended, with it's an ill constrained problem. What is a good photo to begin with? And so I had to explore a bunch of different approaches that were like throwing darts in the dark. Like, does this give better results? I don't know. And so much of it is you go out and you shoot and you see, is it better? And we ultimately settled on a variant of some classical approaches in computer vision slash image processing, combined with some light touches from stuff I learned from HDR and detail recovery there, and some secret sauce there. So it was nice. It's terrifying to have something where some percentage of your results are going to suck, no matter how much, no matter how hard you try. Um, and so, yeah, so it was a scary, but eventually it came together remarkably by a miracle, surprisingly late into the process. So yeah, image processing, and to that, building off that, I would say that with every release, there's something that's always the hardest thing I've ever tackled. And if you aren't perpetually finding yourself tackling the hardest thing in your career, maybe you'll enjoy yourself doing other things. But if you want to be hardcore engineering, it's a good thing to always have something new. They're like, I have no idea how I'm going to do this. I think I'm going to fail. And then the dopamine kick of it coming together and the release coming together. Like, if you can get that harmony, then you're going to be very happy in your career as an engineer.
Now, of highly visible tech problems, you've also been a tech consultant for HBO's Silicon Valley. Tell me more how you landed that gig and what was it like? Because at that point, I guess your decisions are visible to millions of people around the world.
Yeah, between Twitter and Periscope, and then starting Lux, I'd say almost like a gap year. I was closer to 2 years where I was doing more consulting while I was figuring out what I wanted to do next. During that time, I did some work helping out CodePath, which they do workshops for existing engineers who are trying to transition from web to mobile. It was never like a general programming class; it was for people who were mostly senior. But I did like a year helping. I ran courses, workshops in person for a lot of senior engineers, and that was cool. And then a friend of mine, again, who worked in Silicon Valley as a technical consultant, was like, oh, well, they have a need for something a little larger. Do you want to do this? And like, that'd be cool. And so that became like, it was originally talking about doing it for like an episode, and it sort of sprawled out to a whole season. And part of it was answering questions. I got to sit in the writer's room. My greatest accomplishment was like I told a joke there just off the cuff, and Mike Judge laughed, and like Yes, bucket list. And so there's that, but the big task there was building an internal a chat app. Around the second season, they had this app called Bro, which was like yo, and it was like but you could just send a fist bump. And so I built a functioning app that the cast and crew used where they would not just hit fist bump, you could actually chat with each other and send almost like emoji animations. And the original plan was that it would be released to the public, but then you have to go through, because it was with HBO, you have to get sign off there. And I think then we ran the numbers and like, okay, if this takes off, what would it cost? And then, and this was before 2016. And like, I think also people probably got wind of how do you handle user moderation? So in retrospect, I guess is there an alternate timeline where it was publicly released and then it was used by Russian bots to ruin, to interfere with the election? Thankfully, that never happened. So the fact it was never released is perhaps a blessing, but it was fully functional. I mean, I think Kumel Nanjiani tweeted about like, yeah, there was supposed to be a real bro app, but I don't know whatever happened to that. And like, but I built the back end for that, and it was I think everyone learned a bunch from it. And I had a bunch of fun, and I got a cameo out of it. So again, it's one of those kind of funny, just like you stumble into it in the course of your life, and like, how did that happen? I still don't know, and weird adventures like that.
So the app was actually functional. It wasn't just, somebody Photoshop a bunch of PNGs and it dropped on a phone and it's like,
Oh
oh yeah,
no,
this is the app.
no, there's test flights. There's at least 100 people using it. Um, in the test flight for our company, there's still the Bro to Bro app saying pending developer release. The back end is dead. We built it on Parse. So even if I one day hit the release button, I don't think I've ever like gotten the gumption to hit the delete or cancel. Like it still sits there, but yeah, it's fully functional. Yeah, but maybe someday I'll set it as like on a kill switch where when I die, I'll automate a request to release to the public. Although again, you can't sign up for an account, man. Yeah, but
It's going to be like one of those Flappy Bird scenarios where your phone is going to be the only phone with that unique app on it. You can sell it for like 10 grand just because it's the only phone that has it. Who
yeah,
knows?
yeah.
But so you've done Twitter, Periscope, you've been in Silicon Valley as a technical consultant, and then you decided to start Lux. Tell me more about what led you to that decision, because you called out the fact that you wanted to finish this photo app that you were working on, but what went into the decision of saying, you know what, I'll quit my job and I'll just start building something new from scratch?
Yeah, and I'd say that after Twitter and during that 2 year period where I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do, and this is a technique that writers will do, is they'll keep a notepad full of their ideas for stories or sketches and so I had a notes file full of like apps I might want to build, and the goal was, in addition to finally like saying I tried it, it failed, I should work for other people. You got to do it. It would be a calling card for if I want to do graphics programming. And I kept coming back to this idea of a camera app, and it just kept coming back. And I got to a point where I had a list of the features that I would want in a camera app. And I was getting into photography at the time. And I've got, all the gear of a digital SLR. And it's like, okay, when I download a third party app for camera app, one, camera systems on the iPhone were becoming more popular. Two, there was a certain level of business level, like, ultimately it's about luck, period. End of story. You're lucky. There's certain strategic decisions you can make to improve your probability. Who knows if it improves it 5% or 50%, but looking at a camera app and just the timing of the market felt like this had the best chance of getting some popularity. And so I built the technical proof of concept of these are the features that I really want in a camera app, and this is what's missing out there. And I reached out to someone, I got the technical proof of concept done, and then I was like, okay, cool. Now I just got to spend 20 years becoming a world-class designer. Instead, I was like, okay, why don't I team up with now a designer who will make something amazing and beautiful and fits someone who sees eye to eye on taste and what they want out of an app. And so I partnered with Sebastian, who is also living in San Francisco. There was a coffee shop halfway in between us, and we met and like talked about it. And then it took a year because we were still doing consulting and freelancing and projects in between. But it took a year between that first coffee shop meeting and us ultimately shipping Halide 1. And then it unexpectedly gained a lot of popularity. and we kept iterating on the product. And then it took about 2 years probably between that and when it became clear of like we really need to do this full time. And I was still doing another experiment with a good friend. Like, do I want to do a venture backed startup at the time? And we were still toying around with ideas there. And ultimately, you get that fork in the road of like, do you want to do the VC backed approach, which has very different expectations and you can tackle much larger problems, or do you just be like, honestly, and again, I'm still on good terms, I think, with all the folks on that different life path. But it's like, you know what? I just want to do this thing. I think this is really calling to me. And yeah, it's just like, again, I would say that having reached that point in my career where if it fails, what's the worst that could happen? If you're considering doing your own, if you want to do what I do, one, I'll try to talk you out of it. But two, don't expect that you're going to be lucky with the first go. And I would say that uh, I was incredibly lucky, and I don't think that I think there's just as much chance it could have totally failed. And there you go.
So, did you have a backup plan, right? Like jumping into something new that you have not done before, and it's an app that you don't know if it's going to hit what Silicon Valley speak, the product market fit. Did you have kind of a plan of saying, you know what, if this doesn't work out, I can always fall back on something else?
So there's a saying that if you have a backup plan, then or don't have a backup plan because eventually you'll hit the backup plan, right? And that's at least true of actors and a lot of the arts, right? Is that a lot of people, you know, their careers don't take off in acting, and so they go and pursue teaching acting university. Not to diminish that role, but a lot of people I've known who have been successful in acting, they just hold out and do it for. In LA, there's a saying of a 10-year overnight success. Some people they move to LA and they just end up getting lucky within a year. Some people, 10 years in, they end up becoming, I'm not going to name drop, but no, they become very successful. And I saw that actually with a bunch of my friends at the time. Not that I was in a circle of influencers, but it's just like some people, they get lucky. And so for me, my backup plan was this is a calling card, but I want something that I will be so incredibly proud of that even if it fails, I can say I did this and I'm really proud of it. So that's the backup plan. And to that degree, though, I would caution people of saying that don't view it as a meritocracy. Meritocracy is a joke. It doesn't exist. And I think a lot of people approach this sort of stuff as I will make the best possible app. But the fit isn't there, the demographic isn't there, and they can make the best possible app. And like a great artist, someday when they're dead, maybe someone will discover it and it's tragic. Or they'll release an incredible app, but it's 5 years too early, right? Could you have released Uber in 2006 or one of these ride sharing apps before the iPhone was hit critical mass? Could you have released Uber in 2007, the first year of the iPhone, when there weren't enough iPhones out there, right? So, um, I had the backup plan of knowing that even if it failed, I could still present it as a calling card and get a job doing more Periscope or getting a job at another large company there. So yeah, the backup plan was the app, but I would say that I was ignorant enough to think, yeah, this could go either way. Okay. Because if you start doing the odds of the probability of failure, I think there's a reason why so many successful entrepreneurs are kind of insane because they don't know the probability of it failing. They have it's most likely your startup's going to fail, period. It's just the statistics. Go out there, go to one of these VCs, and Y Combinator has a list of companies. And if you run the numbers, like, you're totally going to fail as an entrepreneur at YC. You're going to get acqui-hired, and then congratulations if you win the lottery ticket, you become an Airbnb, but you're totally going to fail. I would put money, if there were such thing as like a stock market for early stage companies, I would get rich shorting all of these early stage companies, right? So anyway.
I feel like that's something that's underestimated by a lot of folks, that the probability of failure is much higher than the probability of success. Because a lot of folks have that, you read a lot of successful stories about folks that, I quit my job and I became, this Instagram influencer or something. And you're like, whoa, cool. Like, somebody did it. I must be able to do the same thing. But like, you don't know their situation. You don't know what kind of funding they have. What
It's also the survivor bias. Yeah, if you have, what is the current batch of YC, every batch now, 1,000 companies or something insane. So, and in 2007, it was like a tiny batch and much more handpicked. And the idea behind venture capital in general, before you do a startup, do research on just how the economics of it work, where the idea behind venture capital is the way that you get to a company that returns 100 or 1,000x return is you put a little money into 1,000 or 10,000 companies, and 99.9% of them are going to fail. That's the idea behind venture capital. If you had something stable that was going to work most of the time, people would go out and get small business loans, right? And people just don't understand the idea of survivor bias. And also, a lot of these people who they look like they're successful, and then if you back channels, you find out that, well, that was actually acqui-hired because so and so actually went to Stanford with the business development of that large company and sort of set up a cushy landing for them. So a lot of what you read, until you're in the valley long enough that you can read between the lines, if you're just reading TechCrunch and you aren't aware of what actually is going on behind the scenes, you get this conception of like, oh yeah, everyone gets bought, and like, yeah, but they basically got bought, and they could have just gone, they could have applied to Google, and they would have avoided all these ulcers they would have gotten from 4 years of running their own company, right? So don't hold yourself to what you read in the tech press.
So, what's the biggest contrast for you as an engineer working at a smaller studio compared to when you worked at Twitter or Periscope?
Um, you have to get things done. And I'd say, by the way, Periscope was amazing as far as productivity when I was working with them, because they were still very much held as they were isolated and able to operate as a small company when I was interacting with them. So I have no complaints about that company. But compared to even Twitter, like a lot of these companies, they get to a large scale, and by virtue of being at that scale, you cannot operate as a startup. As much as I make fun of Facebook for move fast and break things, at a startup, you are able to move very fast because there are few consequences. And trying to operate fast at a large scale like Facebook results in horrible, horrible consequences for society. Or eventually you make a terrible product decision, and I saw that as Twitter was growing, where it just didn't have the checks and balances in places for rolling stuff out. I guess like the fail whale, like, right, you reach a certain point where you can't just roll out 7 deploys per day. You need checks and balances to slow you down. You need a certain immunity to quick changes like that, and that's part of the consequences of working at a large company. On the flip side, a lot of these companies, like look at Amazon. No one uses Amazon for their apps. Their apps suck. Like, they have so many horrible bugs. They're so slow to load. You ask someone why they use Amazon, it's because you can buy something and it'll arrive at your doorstep in 2 days. They have an operational network, which is their moat, and they could release like a horrible app that like forces you to click through a bunch of banners to do anything, and they would still get away with it. And so they have that. They have flywheels where when you're a large enough company, like look at BlackBerry. When the iPhone came out, BlackBerry was flying high for a few years because they had so much inertia. But then eventually, when something is not going well, it all kind of falls apart all at once, right? Where BlackBerry, was like, when it collapsed, it was like near instantaneous. And so if you're a large company, you don't get the feedback loop of when you make poor product decisions or you go down a dark path. It can be years before you see the consequences, which then leads into all sorts of weird dynamics as far as product, where you're incentivized as a product manager. You can get away with doing things that will move metrics short term and then harm the company long term. And you have to deal with all that. Some companies are better at that than others. And to a degree, like an Apple is far from perfect, but they've managed to stay somewhat lean to a fault almost as far as small teams. They don't do the crazy A/B testing that you'll see at large companies. Versus a company that has 200 iOS developers working on a single app, right? So it's not true throughout the industry, but there's no perfect way to scale a company. Just like any kind of large organism, If you're a small company, or my dog can run much faster than I can, right? But you can get to a larger, or birds, they have hollow bone structures so they can fly, right? So at a large company, you just need to have these systems in place that you can't operate like the same way when you're lean.
So now that you're in this lean state, you have to balance engineering and the business side of things. How do you find that balance? Because sometimes it feels terrifying because you want to say that, yeah, I'll start my own company and I'll just do the coding. I'll code day and night and I'll be building this great product. But then you forget about all these logistics and tactical items that you need to tackle for your product to be successful. What's that balance like for you?
I think that it's difficult for me because I think we've reached a certain point in the company where we were able to, and this was probably 2019, where we could make it a lifestyle app. And so you can be a one person company if you are very smart about the niche you carve out. You can just keep doing what you're doing likely for quite a while. I guess there's a certain risk with a lot of lifestyle apps where you can sustain yourself at least a salary of like working in a large tech company, I guess, or even better. And you can just keep doing what you're doing. But then for me and Sebastian, I think we both saw eye to eye is that we want to be able to tackle more things. And then you start hitting a wall as far as hours in the day. And so and I think it was when we reach our second app, is like there's just like we want to maintain our first app, and so to do our second app, we didn't have as much resources to invest in the first app. So part of it is like you then need to learn how to delegate if you're going to scale, right? And it goes back to the mythical man month and all that. And uh, on top of the ability to delegate, is that as far as me and my career, I am not going to be one of those pretentious people like that talks about a 10x engineer, because that's BS. But we'll say this: let's say that you're a senior engineer, you've been doing it for over a decade. You're going to be more productive than if you hire someone, say, who's 2 years out of school, right? It's just a fact. We'll say you're 20% more productive, right? So you know that you can get something done yourself if you just go out there and do it, and especially if you know the code base inside and out. And so you need to become more mature and understand how do you delegate things and how do you give up a little of the product. And again, like I started doing this because I wanted 100% control of the product. And how do you steer the ship as opposed to being like knee deep in it? And that's unfair to the people you're hiring to micromanage them, right? And I hope that I haven't micromanaged anyone yet. And our first hire was someone who's amazing, and she's great at what she does, and so I'm fortunate there. And I think it'll be a little more interesting when we reach the point where we want to hire someone junior, because then you have to walk the line of you need to get stuff done, but you also are just doing a disservice to a junior person if you aren't mentoring them. So it's a lot of non-product stuff. And I think that if you think that being a business owner means that you can just focus on the product, you're going to be super miserable. Like you now have to deal with, like, we have someone part time who helps out in Arizona. He's in university right now, and he's helping edit some of our video tutorials that complement our app. And now I'm dealing with the state of Arizona. To get him officially as a part time employee, you have to register with the state of Arizona. You have to file for an unemployment identifier, but that's a different entity than the main one you have to file with, because you're taking on an employee. So now you have to shoot off emails between these two separate entities, and it's all of these little things that you have to deal with running a business. So if you aren't comfortable with that and you dream of just writing code, maybe a big company is for you. Maybe if you love working on the build system for Android, go take a job at Google, and they will give you straight rails that you follow along where you can ship code, right? So
Yeah, there's a lot of different things that you don't think about as a product owner, as an engineer, when you're starting your own business. But something that do want to call out is that clearly with the apps that you're building, there is a huge focus on craft. And this is something that I don't often see in a lot of the applications that are being built by the big companies that, like you said, they do A/B tests to optimize clicks on, whether it's the blue or this specific shade of blue or this other shade of blue that gives you more clicks. You're focusing on this craft and the polished experience. You mentioned earlier that you had to work together with a designer, with Sebastian, to make sure that you're building this great experience. How did you, as an engineer, get to the point where you're comfortable with thinking about these details that generally engineers just, typically say, you know what, I wrote the code, it works, it's stable, good enough.
Uh, I'll say that it's just the way that I like the apps I run or that I use on my phone. And it could just be I am an incredibly petty human being and I pay attention to these details to the point where I should get diagnosed for obsessive compulsive disorder or something. I don't know if it's just me. And it's very much, I think it's a disservice to not know that there's something that comes with the cost of this detail, right? Where in theory we could ship more features if we didn't obsessed over like why is the animation slightly wrong here? Why is it? Couldn't we just make it a fade out or something? And I think that we're lucky that we've identified a market of people who appreciate this and want this in their app. If I were building a social network, the most important thing with a social network is the network effects and engagement and getting people into the network and having people generate connections, stuff that I'm not interested in. And I think it would be, I guess you could get it like if people are delighted by their app, they're more likely to return to it. I don't know. I don't know. I'm not the person to build a social network, but I would say that um, look at cars. Like there's a Toyota, which is an incredible brand, and I love the process that they make in cars around the Toyota system. Who knows how much of it is just hand wavy, rhetoric, but it's very interesting, the Toyota system and how they build systems for quality. And I would say a Toyota is rock solid, and that's the perception. You can have a Toyota for 20 years, versus you look at an Aston Martin, which the perception is that they are horrible with their electrical systems. Or, oh my God, if you've ever known someone who owns a Land Rover, they'll tell you that the cars are in the shop more often than they drive it, right? So, I mean, there's a certain approach there of just understanding like quality as far as like apps and crash reports. But even then, we want to deliver a premium experience, and that's what people are paying for. It's like, and so even on the higher end, like a Porsche, there are just so many of these small details that if you talk to someone who's passionate about Porsches, like there is a rabid community. Like certain people collect air cooled classic Porsches, and trying to create an audience of people who are as passionate about those attention to details. And I won't pretend that you'll just get that by building an amazing app or what you perceive as an amazing app, and they'll come. But we're very fortunate that once we've identified people that want that, they will appreciate it. Versus if we were to target an audience, and I'll say there are other camera apps out there that try to be a kitchen sink. And I'm not trashing all other camera apps, but there are certain ones in their approaches throw in everything inside the app and get as many checkboxes covered in their app store description as possible. And that's one approach, and good luck with that. But I don't think that that's where we want to go. And I think that that's being jack of all trades and master at none. So then that said, though, there are other great camera apps out there that I've played with. Different, it'd be like Porsche being like Ferraris are cool, and Aston Martins are a gorgeous car. So there's plenty of room for different takes for camera apps. But yeah, so.
Love it. Let's say somebody is wanting to go in your footsteps and start a small studio to build apps. One thing that you would tell them, short of dissuading them, like you mentioned earlier, what would it be?
Are you comfortable with it failing? In all probability, it's going to fail. Make sure that you have a safety net, right? And that's the big secret. And also, I don't think it's a coincidence that if you look at the people who call themselves self-made billionaires, they had rich parents. So there's that. Don't dilute yourself there. And ask what you're going to do beyond the app, because a lot of what we do, we have a very strong we have experience with PR and marketing, and we made the decision to get into camera apps just looking at the market space. So a perfect example of like something, if I were not building camera apps in photography, and market to get into, which would be interesting, would be fitness. I looked at fitness apps, and if you looked at, I wanted an app that would help keep track of like my different reps and like where I'm at as far as curling and push-ups, right? And all the apps sucked, and I would pay $6. I'd pay $10 for a super polished app that just worked. And fitness is an area that people spend billions, that's with a B, billions of dollars every year on. And if you talk to people in fitness, they are passionate about fitness. So that would be something that would be interesting to get into. But if you think that you're going to build the next Facebook and you're not taking on God knows how much in venture capital, and you don't have a strategy that's like, we'll start with Harvard and get the influencers, like, don't enter a gunfight with a spoon, with a spork, right? So understand what you're capable of, what are your strengths, and then make a reasoned assessment about what is the ones that will be the statistically highest chance of a successful outcome. But and if you fail, would you have an amazing calling card? And I've known people who they did the independent thing for a while and it didn't work out, but they end up they are incredibly happy now working at like Apple or one of these large companies. And so if you enjoy the journey, then it isn't as much of a work, but just recognize that not everyone is set up enough in life that it will work out. And I didn't do it until I was in my mid 30s. So don't get into a rush, and just have fun.
These are fantastic insights. Ben, thank you so much for sharing them with us. Where can people learn more about your work online?
You can follow me on Twitter. I'm at Sandofsky. That's Sand of Sky. But if you want to follow the company, we post a bunch about the company and product development in addition to product features. It's lux.camera is the new site that we relaunched. We're now self-hosting, and we're going to be posting there a bunch. And we have links to all of our social media there. So yeah, those two are pretty cool.
Love the TLD. Ben, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thanks. Well, thanks for having me.